Okay, so next we have causes of inflation. Causes of inflation pay again very repetitive question. Now this looks complicated, but this is actually to simplify things for you when you revise things. ये जो मैं तुम्हें यहाँ पे break down दे रहा हूँ. So causes of inflation में remember the two main things that we talked about are demand pull and cost push inflation, and we learned how we can explain and sort of define what they are through this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So demand pull inflation is when aggregate demand increases, and cost push inflation is when aggregate supply decreases. So both lead to an increase in price level, but this is due to shifts of aggregate supply, this is due to shift or increase of aggregate demand. उसके बाद I told you to think about these causes in terms of कि अच्छा demand pull inflation, fine, we say it is because of an increase in aggregate demand, but aggregate demand has 4 different components, and the government, external sector, and the private households and firms, they can all be responsible for creating this increase in aggregate demand and therefore this demand pull inflation. So उसमें तुमने गवर्नमेंट का याद रखना है. द गवर्नमेंट कैन बी अ कॉज ऑफ इंक्रीजिंग एग्रीगेट डिमांड एंड देयरफॉर डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन बिकॉज ऑफ एक्सपेंशनरी मॉनेटरी एंड फिस्कल पॉलिसी. Now इसमें I would expect you to remember कि when we say expansionary monetary policy, we are talking about particular changes in money supply, exchange rate and interest rate. And when we talk about expansionary fiscal policy, we are talking about specific changes in income tax and government spending. उनको you can explain and expand upon those as much as you want, but the basic idea is that government through expansionary monetary fiscal policy can increase the aggregate demand and therefore it can be a source of demand pull inflation. External sector, it can affect your net exports component and therefore it can be a source of increase in aggregate demand and demand pull inflation. And private households and firms, यहाँ पे this is we talk about that thing again and again, the consumer and producers or business confidence. If that changes, then households will start consuming more and firms will start investing more, and therefore that can be another source of increase in aggregate demand and demand pull inflation. So एक तुमने ये चीज़ याद रखनी है, how these different players in the macro economy can be a source of increased aggregate demand. And similarly, in terms of cost push inflation, yes, the basic theoretical idea is aggregate supply कम हो जाती है. Why that may happen? That may happen because of increases in cost of production in the country, which in turn can be because of exchange rate depreciation, because of global oil or we say global energy prices. It can be because of government putting indirect taxes on some essential inputs such as petrol. It can be due to minimum wage laws where the government come in and maybe stipulates a minimum wage जिसकी वजह से wages बढ़ती हैं, cost of production बढ़ता है. And it can also be due to the activities of labor unions. Now of course there can be many other ways, there can be many other macro changes जिसकी वजह से cost of production बढ़ती है और maybe जिसकी वजह से aggregate demand बढ़ती है, but these are the more common ones, these are the ones which will in most of the cases knowing them will be enough, it will be more than enough. Now here on the cost push inflation side, you can again think in terms of who amongst the government or the firms or the external sector is responsible for cost push inflation. So exchange rate को तुम कह सकते हो this is an external source of inflation. Global oil prices बढ़ जाती हैं, that is again an external source of inflation. ये indirect taxes and minimum wage laws, they are in the hands of the government, so government can be a source of cost push inflation. And labor union activity, this is in the hands of the firms, so even the firms can be a source of cost push inflation. So this is your knowledge of causes of inflation, and with this knowledge, इससे ज़्यादा तुम्हें, you don't need anything more than that. With just this thing, we will now look at question number 6 to question number 22. And let me actually take this thing over there. एक second रुको. So question number 6 to question number 22. आवाज़ आ रही है? ज़रा मुझे प्लीज़ बीच में कंफर्म कर दिया करो. When you go very silent, मुझे शक पड़ने लग जाता है. Screen, voice, everything is okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay जी. So causes of inflation में, and actually I have to start off over here. Causes of inflation में you will first see some very easy question that will ask you what are the components of aggregate demand and explain what is demand pull inflation. Then you will see a separate set of questions that will ask you to compare demand pull cost push inflation, and then sometimes you will get these variables as to how money supply or changes in exchange rate and changes in the price of energy can be causes of inflation. इसमें again we will use the same structure. There can be demand pull inflation, there can be cost push inflation. वही structure follow करेंगे and I'll give you the precise answer just now. और उसके बाद आखिर में we have a couple of unusual questions asking you who amongst the consumers, producers or government is most likely to cause inflation. So we will put the answers of all of these different questions in that same structure that I showed you. So सबसे पहले aggregate demand और demand pull inflation पे आ जाओ. So that is going to be question number 6 to 9. So this one, first one is from the specimen paper 2016. Define the components of aggregate demand and with the help of a diagram, explain how an increase in spending in an economy might result in inflation. Now, I'm sorry. I don't know why do you guys miss this thing. I mean, I shouldn't be explaining this to you. If a question is specifically asking you that explain through a diagram, then please convince yourselves कोई लंबे चिट्ठे नहीं लिखने. I have to show a simple diagram and explain in 3-4 lines through that diagram whatever the examiner is asking. So components of aggregate demand, the way you would answer this question or the way I would answer this question is that aggregate demand is the demand for the country's total output coming from all the 4 sectors, and the demand coming from the households is known as consumption. The demand coming from एक second, and the demand for country's total output coming from the firms is known as investment. That coming from the government is simply known as G, and that coming from the external sector, that is known as exports minus imports or net exports. Now इसमें you can always mention some small little detail जब ये components बता रहे हो कि government expenditure में. Remember, I always tell you that things like pensions, वो जो चीज़ें and unemployment benefits, they are not included in government spending, meaning that if you see that your government in the year spent a total amount of 100 rupees and out of those 100 rupees 5 were on pensions and 10 were on unemployment benefits. So this is where we are saying that this G component of aggregate demand, it would include every spending done by the government excluding pensions and excluding unemployment benefits. So यहाँ पे 85 rupees will be included as the G part of your aggregate demand. Now again, you don't have to give this numerical example. तुमने सिर्फ छोटी सी detail बता देनी है कि government spending means every spending done by the government. The only thing included or only things excluded are things like pensions, unemployment benefits, which are known as transfer payments. And what it means is that look, pension तुम किसी retired बंदे को दे रहे हो, not for something that they are producing in this year, but for something they had produced somewhere in some earlier year. So it won't constitute aggregate demand for current year's production. Anyhow, small little detail, again not that important.
सर
जी
सर तो फिर हम ये जो ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स हैं क्योंकि ये पास जो साल है उनकी होती है, तो इनको फिर हम कैसे वो करते हैं मैनेज? इनको हम मतलब इक्वली उसको डिवाइड करके पूरे सालों में कर देते हैं?
नहीं, they are just not included. तुम्हारा क्वेश्चन अच्छा है, बट येस दे आर सॉर्ट ऑफ मिस्ड. ट्रांसफ़र पेमेंट का मतलब भी ये है कि लोग दे हैव बीन मिस्ड आउट. पिछले साल के जीडीपी को तो अपडेट कर नहीं सकते, बट एटलीस्ट टेक इट आउट फ्रॉम द करंट ईयर. दिस इज़ नॉट फॉर समथिंग विच इज़ बीइंग प्रोड्यूस राइट नाउ. वो जो तुम्हारा क्वेश्चन है उसको फिट कहाँ पे करते हैं? ऑब्वियसली आई मीन एग्रीगेट डिमांड इज़ नॉट दी ओनली थिंग गोइंग इन द इकॉनमी. सो हम सिर्फ ये कहते हैं कि एग्रीगेट डिमांड की कैलकुलेशन में से एक्सक्लूड दीज ट्रांसफ़र पेमेंट्स, बट ऑब्वियसली दे आर इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग्स, दे आर नॉट इग्नोर्ड, क्योंकि जो गवर्नमेंट का बजट होता है दैट इज़ समथिंग सेपरेट बट वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग, जिसका दे आर इम्पैक्टेड इन अ बिग वे through these amounts of कितनी transfer payments हो रही हैं. So it is important in its own right. Aggregate demand के लिए important नहीं है. Concept यही है कि here we are trying to measure the total demand for this year's output. So this is reflecting spending on some other year's output. So we exclude it. Did I answer your question?
जी सर.
ठीक है. अच्छा, so again I mean जी आमना.
सर इन ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स के बारे में इतना ज़्यादा मतलब
नहीं इतना ज़्यादा पता करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. बट आई मीन द रीज़न आई हैव मेंशन देम इज़ कि एक तो तुम्हें ऐसे में पॉइंट मिलेगा, दूसरा यू विल सी देम समटाइम्स इन योर MCQs व्हाट इज़ एक्सक्लूडेड फ्रॉम एग्रीगेट डिमांड, और उसमें तुम्हें ट्रांसफ़र पेमेंट या अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट नज़र आएगी. सो दैट इज़ व्हाट वेयर आई वांट यू टू रिमेंबर दिस कि ट्रांसफ़र पेमेंट और अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट्स और दिस वर्ड ट्रांसफ़र पेमेंट इटसेल्फ, एग्जामिनर एक्सपेक्ट्स यू टू नो कि ये चीज़ें एग्रीगेट डिमांड में नहीं आती. सो इट मे कम अप इन एन MCQ तुम देखोगी तो उसमें हैं एक तो ऐसे MCQs. सो उसी हिसाब से तुमने इस पर टाइम लगाना है. डोंट गो इनटू टू माई डिटेल, जस्ट रिमेंबर दे आर एक्सक्लूडेड फ्रॉम योर एग्रीगेट डिमांड कैलकुलेशंस. शैल वी मूव ऑन?
यस सर.
चलो अच्छा, so we have defined the components of aggregate demand. उसके बाद with the help of diagram explain how an increase in spending in an economy might result in inflation. Now मैंने तुम्हें क्लास में I mentioned this thing. If you have forgotten, I want you to remind yourselves again कि मैं demand pull inflation का जो graph है, I have been telling you that you can just simply make a starting equilibrium and then shift the aggregate demand to the right, and you will explain this question कि increased spending होगी means increased aggregate demand होगी, it will shift to the right and demand pull inflation होगी. But I told you that whenever you are explaining anything related to shifts of aggregate demand and demand pull inflation, तो तुमने ये Keynesian aggregate supply के थ्रू वो क्वेश्चन एक्सप्लेन करना है. एंड द सिंपल रीज़न इज़ कि द कॉन्सेप्ट ब्रॉडली स्पीकिंग इज़ द सेम, but the only difference or the only detail that this gives you is that look, if the economy is initially starting at an equilibrium where it is much below its potential GDP, then there will be, and let's say this is your potential GDP over here जहाँ aggregate supply straight हो गई है. So this is where we say that look, economy में बहुत spare capacity है, so if there is more spending and aggregate demand increases to let's say this AD2 instead of AD1, तो इतनी inflation नहीं होगी. On the y-axis you can see over here there is not so much of inflation but output बढ़ेगी. But if your economy is sitting close to its potential and then aggregate demand or aggregate spending increases, then there will be a lot of inflation. प्राइस लेवल्स बहुत बढ़ जाएंगे relative to a very small increase in your GDP. So always remember this thing. Separate question भी आता है, but even if the question is not stressing कि हमेशा aggregate demand से demand pull inflation होगी, just make it a habit that I am going to explain demand pull inflation by drawing this particular aggregate supply, so I can show different cases. If you are much below your capacity and then aggregate demand increases, there won't be a lot of inflation. But if you are already at your potential and then aggregate demand increases, there will be a lot of inflation and slight increase in your GDP. You can explain it purely through the graph. I would say you must explain it purely through the graph. And then as a secondary thing, if you want, तो you can give the logic behind it कि यहाँ पे capacity बहुत है, so if firms suddenly see more demand for their products, they would be more than happy to produce more and supply something instead of fighting for higher price levels. Second way of explaining this is कि अगर इतनी spare capacity है तो as you start producing more, the cost of production, the cost of resources, the cost of labor, it won't be under any pressure to increase because there will be so much unemployment. लोग नौकरी के लिए तरले मिन्नतें खा रहे होंगे. But if you are at your potential and then aggregate demand increases, so firms will try to respond, they will try to produce more, but since you are close to your potential, there won't be any spare resources. It would be very difficult to find good labor and good people to work for you. So that will start bidding up the wages, that would start bidding up the prices of all the different things in the economy कि और आप बना ही नहीं सक रहे, but there is more and more demand, so फिर inflation बहुत ज़्यादा होगी. So that is the sort of understanding, verbal explanation. इसमें I mean if you feel good, if you feel comfortable with your English, verbal explanation भी दे दो, but if you have to pick one, stick to this theoretical graphical explanation that will cover you for everything. ये ठीक है? इज इट क्लियर? इस चीज़ से कंफ्यूज तो नहीं होते व्हेन आई क्विकली कन्वर्ट दीज एग्रीगेट सप्लाई कर्व्स? Is everybody okay? Is everybody with me on this?
Yes.
Okay. बाकी लोग भी ज़रा माइक अपना खोल लो, पैसे नहीं लगेंगे.
Yes, sir.
ओके. शर्जील, अभी पूछ लो जो पूछना है, जो बाद में मेरे से पूछोगे. ठीक है अभी तक?
जी सर, सही है.
ऑल राइट, चलो लेट अस मूव ऑन. मैं पहला क्वेश्चन तुम्हें डिटेल में करा रहा हूँ, रेस्ट आर ऑल द सेम. सो एक्चुअली दैट कवर्स इट. एग्रीगेट डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन हमेशा तुमने इस तरह से शो करनी है. लेट मी नाउ लुक एट द नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन. जून 2015. Define each component and using a diagram show how a reduction in price of the in reduction in one of these components might reduce inflationary pressures in economy. So there is typo here. Define each component of aggregate demand. So it's exactly the same question. Aggregate demand, remember to say, use these words, is the total demand for country's total output in any given year of period of time, and this total demand has 4 components coming from the 4 sectors. फिर से वही सारी चीज़ repeat. Show how a reduction in one of these components might reduce inflationary pressures in an economy. So कोई भी factor pick कर लेना, C, I, G, N, X. If you have to give a good answer, so instead of just saying let's assume investment falls, instead of saying that, make it a better answer by saying let's assume interest rates in the country increase, because of which cost of borrowing increases and therefore firms start to borrow less and invest less, and therefore aggregate demand falls. It's the same thing, लेकिन तुम्हें ये चीज़ पता है तो just give a little bit of more detail. Otherwise this question is straightforward. Again, make sure you don't forget to use this specific aggregate supply curve. So let me draw. अभी तुमने इसमें करना है reduction in aggregate demand. How can that reduce inflationary pressures? So if you are starting at some equilibrium like this, where there's too much excess capacity and aggregate demand falls, there would hardly be any change in the price levels. But if you are sitting near your potential and then aggregate demand falls, then yes, price levels will fall significantly. End of answer. थोड़ा सा reasonable रहा करो. It's 8 marks, it's more than enough. And trust me, if you can explain these graphs, you are telling the examiner a lot. So निकाल लो अपने जेन से ये चीज़ कि कितना लंबा आंसर, किस स्ट्रक्चर में आंसर. दिस इज़ द इकोनॉमिक्स. यू कैन गिव इट टू द एग्जामिनर. इट वोंट लीव हिम विद अ लॉट ऑफ ऑप्शंस ऑफ डिडक्टिंग एनी मार्क्स. देने पड़ेंगे उसको नंबर. एंड वन मिस्टेक दैट आई एम डूइंग माई सेल्फ ओवर हेयर एंड आई शुडंट बी डूइंग दैट, मेक इट अ हैबिट. इवन इफ़ यू आर डूइंग रफ एनालिसिस, ऑलवेज लेबल योर एक्सेस, ताकि पेपर में ना भूलो. You miss the excess and you throw to waste all of your hard work. So excess का तुमने ध्यान रखना है. Now next question, June 2013. Define the components of aggregate demand and with the help of diagram explain how an increase in spending might result in inflation. It's repeat. And June 2013, paper 2-1. Okay, this is paper 2-2, this is 2-1. With the help of diagrams, analyze the factors that will lead to an increase in aggregate demand in an economy and discuss whether this increase is more likely to have an impact on inflation or unemployment in the economy. So isme again, read the question carefully, underline and separate out the different parts that these long questions ask you. So if you look at this question, तो इसमें 2 parts हैं. Analyze the factors that would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So that is the first thing. You have to discuss the factors that can shift the aggregate demand to the right, and then you have to discuss whether this increase is more likely to have an impact on inflation or unemployment. So inflation होगी या unemployment होगी. So this combines 2 parts. We have, मैंने तुम्हें रट्टा लगवाया था, money supply, interest rate, exchange rate, income tax, and government spending, and investor and consumer confidence. इस चीज़ का मैंने तुम्हें रट्टा लगाया था, how each can impact aggregate demand. So first part, gives you a lot of ammunition. Remember the links: money supply, people will or households will have more money, so consumption part of aggregate demand will increase, therefore aggregate demand shifts. Interest rate, if it falls, the borrowing of households and firms will increase, and therefore consumption investment increase. Exchange rate will affect the price of import export, and therefore net exports will increase if, for instance, exchange rate depreciates. If income tax falls, households will be richer, their disposable incomes increase, consumption increases, aggregate demand increases. Government spending is a direct component of your aggregate demand, and investor consumer confidence, when that improves, then consumption and investment increases. So ye sara, I mean, I have gone through that quickly, but we have spent a lot of time. I have told you again and again, you have to memorize these links, so you will throw them here in the first part of your question, and it will be totally stupid of you to lose any mark over here. कम से कम तुम्हें यहीं से 8 marks निकालने चाहिए. Again, remember examiner reports, if you look at them, they will tell you maximum of up to 8 marks for this first part. So it's not even necessarily 6 marks. They even give you the sort of space कि अच्छा यार इनमें से एक चीज़ भी ज़्यादा अच्छी explain कर सकते हो ना, तो we'll give you more than half the marks for it. But don't go into those bad habits कि इधर से marks निकाल लूँ और दूसरे छोड़ दूँ. You know the other part. Discuss whether this increase is more likely to have an impact on inflation or unemployment. This is where I tell you कि जब भी aggregate demand pull inflation की बात कर रहे हो, तो use this version of your aggregate supply, and the way you answer that second question is exactly the same. If you are starting where your economy is much below capacity and then aggregate demand increases, there won't be a lot of inflation, only GDP will increase. Whereas if you are already starting at the potential and then aggregate demand increases, yes, there will be a lot of inflation and there will be only a slight increase in GDP. So ये diagram जो है, again I hope after this you won't forget demand pull inflation, use this fancy aggregate supply. Any questions on this? जल्दी से मुझे बताओ. Anything anybody wants to ask on this?
सर हम किनीजियन और ये वाला मतलब इंटरचेंजेबली हम यूज कर सकते हैं, मतलब यहाँ पे
बिल्कुल कर सकते हो. इट इज़ परफेक्टली फाइन यूजुअली. बाकी हर जगह पे तुम्हारे लिए दिस वुड बी मोर सिंपल. सीधी सी एग्रीगेट सप्लाई एग्रीगेट डिमांड बना लो. आई एम सेइंग इट इज़ मोर यूजफुल जस्ट इन द केस ऑफ डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन के ये फैंसी सी तुम एग्रीगेट सप्लाई बना लो. आई मीन इफ़ यू आर कंफर्टेबल एंड यू नो बोथ, तुम्हारी मर्जी है. अनलेस ही आस्क यू द स्पेसिफिक क्वेश्चन कि डिमांड बढ़ रही है, एग्रीगेट डिमांड बढ़ रही है, विल इट ऑलवेज कॉज इन्फ्लेशन. आई मीन दिस मॉनिटरिस वर्जन कैन ऑल्सो एक्सप्लेन दिस. मैंने तुम्हें करवाया नहीं है बिकॉज देन इट विल गेट कॉम्प्लिकेटेड. बट टू आंसर योर क्वेश्चन ब्रीफली, totally up to you. Whichever version you are comfortable with, you can use that. Anything else? किसी ने कुछ और पूछना हो? No? अच्छा चलो. Should I pick up the speed or is it fine? बताओ मुझे. I mean, I can pick up a bit of speed.
Sir, it is fine.
आमना फट बोली इससे पहले कि कोई और बोल पड़े. But you win. चलो. अच्छा जी. So let me quickly go back to the first page. So we said some questions on the causes of inflation are AD and demand pull inflation. Then the next category is sort of where the examiner asks you about both demand pull, cost push in the same question. So those are the next 6-7 questions. Let me take you through them. Demand pull versus cost push inflation together. Now explain what causes inflation. It's a repeat. I hope I don't have to repeat all of this. ये पूरा एनालिसिस तुमने देना है और उसमें उसको एक्सटेंड इसी तरह करना है कि once you explain it through the graph that this is your demand pull inflation when aggregate demand increases, start explaining that look, the government can be responsible for this increase in aggregate demand, even the external sector can be responsible, and sometimes it's just the consumer and households confidence, investors confidence. Similarly, cost push inflation graph से show करो and then give a few reasons, explain them कि क्यों cost of production बढ़ सकती है. Now इधर cost of production के अलावा do remember I haven't written them over here. Cost of production के अलावा do remember I mentioned that जो तुम्हारे मुल्क की resources होती हैं, land, labor, capital, enterprise, their quantity and their quality and their mobility, Remember, we said these are also the things that will shift both or change both the potential output as well as the short run aggregate supply. So don't forget that इनमें से भी कोई रीज़न आता है तो basically what interests economists is कि ये potential output ही change कर देते हैं economy को. So one way of thinking about it is that if something is powerful enough to change the entire potential output, it would also be powerful enough to increase or decrease the short run aggregate supply. Anyhow, so explain what causes inflation. Agla, explain the difference between cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. It's exactly the same question. Focus on the graphs. Don't miss the importance of the graphs. एक दफ़ा ग्राफ बना लेते हो तो you should tell yourselves that you can relax, you have done most of the explanation. उसके बाद जो तुम ऐड कर रहे हो, don't be random about it. ये चीज़ें तुमने पहले से याद करके जानी है क्योंकि this is how I explain the causes of demand pull inflation. अच्छा, I mean, I am assuming that you would be intelligent enough to do it, but let me just, tell it explicitly. जब ये difference कर रहे हो ना between cost push inflation and demand pull inflation, one important point you should raise is कि देखो जब demand pull inflation होती है ना तो तुम्हारा जो GDP है at least that increases, whereas जब cost push inflation होती है तो whatever was your GDP, once the aggregate supply shifts to the left, एक तो इन्फ्लेशन हो गई, दूसरा तुम्हारा GDP भी कम हो जाता है. So that is something that do mention it. GDP also falls, demand pull inflation में at least your GDP increases as the economy suffers from inflation. So that is where you can say if you have to pick, if you have to choose, this is one good solid reason of saying that cost push inflation is more harmful or it is more damaging. Economy shrink भी हो रही है और price levels भी बढ़ रहे हैं. Demand pull inflation, at least your economy is expanding, GDP is increasing, employments are increasing, so at least some things are getting better. So that is something to remember. Agla question, using diagrams explain the difference between demand pull and cost push causes of inflation. Next question, use aggregate demand, aggregate supply to distinguish between cost pull demand. Exact repeat. Explain with the use of aggregate demand supply the different effect of cost push and demand pull inflation on real output. It is the same question. इसमें तुम्हारे लिए उसने आसान कर दिया है actually something that I just mentioned. फिर से वही आंसर होगा कि your demand pull inflation is when your aggregate demand increases, shifts to the right, और उस ग्राफ के थ्रू ही you just mention this that look GDP तुम्हारा बढ़ जाएगा. Here again demand pull inflation है, make this fancy curve and start getting more marks कि look अगर तो आप कैपेसिटी से बहुत नीचे बैठे हुए हो then the aggregate demand increases, so inflation थोड़ी सी होगी, GDP will increase a lot, whereas if you are at your potential and then aggregate demand increases तो फिर price levels बहुत बढ़ जाएंगे and GDP won't increase a lot. So that is your demand pull inflation and output की पूरी detail. As far as cost push inflation is concerned, उसमें you always get this bad result कि cost push inflation हुई है तो price भी बढ़ेगी और तुम्हारा GDP भी कम होगा. So same things, all these questions again and again I tell you, they revolve around these same things. You just have to be sensible कि इसमें से कौन सा हिस्सा पूछा जा रहा है and therefore which one I will stress more about. आंखें बंद करके ना आंसर दिया करो. I am myself telling you these are all very very similar questions, but make sure that you look at these specific details. In any case, once you understand these things within the structure, you will be covering all of these things. But if you specifically see something being mentioned in the question, तो I mean all of you are sensible enough कि तुम्हें पता होना चाहिए कि यार इस वाली चीज़ पे मैंने ज़रा ज़्यादा स्ट्रेस करना है और I have to ensure कि ये वाला पॉइंट ना मिस हो जाए. Next, 2012 paper 2-3 question 4a. How does aggregate demand and supply analysis explain the existence of inflation in the short run? Again, it's the same analysis. Demand pull inflation when aggregate demand increases, cost push inflation when the aggregate supply decreases. नीचे तुमने detail दे देनी है कि what are some of the reasons why aggregate demand may increase, what are some of the reasons why aggregate supply may increase. And then 2014, discuss whether inflation is more likely to be caused by a shift in economy's aggregate demand or shift in the economy's aggregate supply. Now इसको भी तुम उसी तरह से start करोगे. There are two types of inflation, demand pull and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is the inflation that is caused by an increase in aggregate demand. Explain it through this graph. और कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन को भी फिर वही घिसा पिटा रट्टा एक्सप्लेन करोगे, दिस इज़ कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन। सो 12 में से 5-6 नंबर तुम्हें पहले इसी रट्टे के मिल जाने, देन यू हैव टू आंसर दी एक्चुअल क्वेश्चन। वेदर इन्फ्लेशन, इज़ इट मोर लाइकली टू बी कॉज बाय, मतलब बेसिकली वो तुम्हारे से पूछ रहा है कि इज़ डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन मोर कॉमन देन कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन। आई टोल्ड यू समथिंग अबाउट दिस इन द क्लास, याद है किसी को? What did I tell you about what is the most common reason why these monetarists say कि inflation होती है मुल्क में? Can anybody remember that?
सर मनी सप्लाई, आपने एक कोड भी दी थी, पता नहीं को बंदा।
Very good, Milton Friedman. He said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. So यहाँ पे I mean एक तो तुम वो चीज़ mention करोगे and think of this not just as an answer to this question, but think of this as something that you should remember even otherwise, कि ये जो हम सारा एग्रीगेट डिमांड एग्रीगेट सप्लाई का मॉडल पढ़ रहे हैं और शॉर्ट रन फ्लक्चुएशंस पढ़ते हैं कि शॉर्ट रन में ADAS शिफ्ट हो रहे हैं, देयरफॉर द मैक्रो इक्विलिब्रियम इज चेंजिंग, मीनिंग इकोनॉमी में GDP कभी ग्रो कर रहा है, कभी श्रिंक कर रहा है, प्राइस लेवल्स कभी बढ़ रहे हैं, कभी कम हो रहे हैं। ये जो सारे बिजनेस साइकिल्स हैं ना, आई मीन वी कॉल दीज शॉर्ट टर्म फ्लक्चुएशंस इकोनॉमीज बिजनेस साइकिल्स। Theoretically, as we have been showing, both changes in aggregate demand as well as changes in aggregate supply, they can both be cause of these short run fluctuations, they can both be cause of these business cycles, but asal mein usually it's the aggregate demand that fluctuates often or more frequently. Aggregate demand का कौन सा component सबसे volatile है? Again I told you that in the class. Out of C, I, G and X, what changes most frequently?
सर फर्म्स।
नहीं, एग्रीगेट डिमांड फर्म्स तो नहीं है ना, एग्रीगेट डिमांड इज CIGNX. So investment. Okay, so a good proper answer, this is a difficult question, यहाँ तुम सारे तुक्के छोड़ के आओगे, and this is where the examiner is trying to figure out कि असल economics भी आती है रट्टे लगाए हुए, and this is where you will give all of this easy explanation, get your 6 marks like every other Tom, Dick and Harry will be getting 6 marks in this question कि ये demand pull होती है, ये cost push होती है। तुमने again लंबे चौड़े कहानी किससे नहीं डालने, if you can remember what I told you in the class कि देखो theoretically aggregate demand, aggregate supply, all are possible, even practically everything can change. Aggregate supply, cost of production, पाकिस्तान में you can say give the example of petrol, रोज़ कीमत बढ़ती है, रोज़ cost of production change होती है, but you see that is an unusual thing. हम उस हुकूमत को फिर सारा दिन गालियाँ निकालते हैं कि इनसे इकोनॉमी कंट्रोल नहीं हो रही, because this is not something normal. That price of petrol is changing every couple of weeks, and the very reason this is not normal is कि आप कहते हो आप फर्म्स को मुल्क में cost of production ही नहीं पता चलने दे रहे कितनी है, so that will create a very bad economic condition. So any proper functioning economy वो अपनी cost of production बार बार नहीं हिलने देते, they manage it so that firms they can plan ahead and you know so on and so forth. But aggregate demand जो है in most of the countries it changes because central bank वो बाज ही नहीं आता मनी सप्लाई के साथ पंगा लेने से. The main job of the central bank is to keep changing on this money supply and therefore try to control the economy. So it's usually the central bank who changes the money supply, and that money supply in turn has an effect on the interest rate. It can also have the impact on exchange rate, but exchange rate तक जाने की ज़रूरत नहीं है तुम्हें. So you wrap this question up by saying aggregate demand changes more frequently, and within aggregate demand it's basically the money supply that the central banks keep on playing around with, which in turn affects the interest rates in the economy and therefore the investment component of your aggregate demand. This is the most volatile thing. Volatile से मतलब ये पूरे साल में sometimes even after every couple of months interest rates keep on changing, therefore investment activity keeps on changing, and therefore demand pull inflation is a more common reason. We are not saying कि हमेशा demand pull inflation होगी, we are saying it's a more common reason. Now money supply के बाद I mean और कोई चीज़ रह जाती है, you can also say a few words about government spending. कि government spending, as I said, sometimes you have to change that independently of you know what you want your aggregate demand to look like. So throughout the year, if you consider, there will be many times when the government has to either spend more or spend less, not because they are trying to control aggregate demand, but because of many other reasons. Kabhi they just run out of money. So they may wish to spend more, but they can't, so they have to decrease their spending. कभी कभी आई मीन देर आर अदर रीजंस. मैं तुम्हें हमेशा नेचुरल डिज़ास्टर का एग्जांपल देता हूँ. नेचुरल डिज़ास्टर आ गया, गवर्नमेंट ने लोगों की हेल्प करनी करनी है. दे हैव टू इंक्रीज देयर स्पेंडिंग. सो गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग भी वॉलेटाइल होती है, एंड देयरफॉर another reason why demand pull inflation is more common, it is more likely. कोई क्वेश्चन इस चीज़ पे? This comparison of demand pull versus cost push, it's easy, it's repetitive. If you are lucky, you will come across such a question in your exam. Anything anybody wants to ask? कितने रह गए? The attendance today was already very poor. You want to continue? बाकी questions देखने हैं. Tell me, you want another session? जल्दी से बताओ. You have 1 minute and 44 seconds. If the Zoom session ends without an answer, I would assume काफ़ी हो गई है.
Yes sir.
अच्छा चलो join a new session then. इसको ख़त्म करो, 1 minute रह गया. Anyhow, let us move on. अगले जो मैंने 3 क्वेश्चन सेपरेट किए हैं, आई मीन आई कुड हैव kept it in the same first category, but here I just wanted to highlight for you that sometimes he will specifically, instead of asking you अच्छा demand pull, cost push, he will specifically ask you अच्छा exchange rate changes से inflation कैसे होती है, money supply changes से inflation कैसे होती है, and price of energy से inflation कैसे होती है. Now we have covered this question already because हम फिर से यही आंसर करेंगे कि there are 2 types of inflation, demand pull and cost push inflation. We will again show the graphs of both of these inflations. और उसके बाद if the question is asking you exchange rate, तो याद रखो exchange rate when it depreciates, the net exports component of your aggregate demand increases, so that would cause demand pull inflation. Exchange rate depreciation say, remember imports prices are increasing, so if you are importing raw materials such as inputs such as oil and petroleum and other inputs such as maybe aluminium and steel, so wo imported raw materials, their price will increase and therefore the cost of production will increase, the aggregate supply will shift to the left and therefore cost push inflation bhi ho sakti hai. So that is the reason exchange rate ke pange lete hai tumhare sath examiner. It can be a source of both demand pull as well as cost push inflation. Demand pull because exchange rate when it depreciates, so net exports बढ़ती हैं, aggregate demand increases. Cost push because if exchange rate is depreciating, your imported raw materials price will increase, cost of production will increase, and therefore cost push inflation भी होगी. Are you okay with this thing? Exchange rate दोनों inflations कैसे cause करता है? Anybody wants me to explain that any further? चलो, no. अच्छा, energy prices again, remember it, we are talking about an increase in the price of oil, and when oil becomes more expensive, the cost of production increases and therefore your aggregate supply will shift to the right. So oil से cost push inflation हो जाएगी, global energy prices से cost push inflation हो जाएगी. And then और क्या रह जाता है? मनी सप्लाई का लिंक वी हैव डन दैट इन डिटेल. मैंने तुम्हें कहा था सिंपल आंसर इज़ व्हेन देयर इज़ मोर मनी, हाउस होल्ड विल इवेंचुअली गेट दैट मोर मनी एंड देयरफॉर द कंजम्पशन component of aggregate demand will increase. And I told you the proper answer is that when money supply increases, then the interest rates in the economy will fall, and when interest rates fall, the exchange rate will also fall. Now ये जो link है between interest rate and exchange rate, we will learn more about that when we study exchange rates, but अभी के लिए I told you that this is the proper mechanism or the way in which monetary policy works through the macroeconomy. Money supply, it affects your interest rate, which in turn affects your exchange rate. So money supply, for instance, if you increase it, there will be more money, so the cost of borrowing money, the interest rate will fall, uski wajah se investment will decrease and aggregate demand will shift to the left. Whereas falling interest rate in turn means exchange rates will fall, which would mean that net export component of aggregate demand will increase and therefore aggregate demand will move to the right. यहाँ पे भी अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट फॉल कर रहे हैं तो एग्रीगेट डिमांड विल इंक्रीज. सो ये मनी सप्लाई की एक्सप्लेनेशन है. अगेन यू हैव 2 चॉइसेस. इफ़ यू डोंट फील कंफर्टेबल यू कैन गिव अ सिंपल आंसर. पूरे नंबर नहीं मिलेंगे कि मनी सप्लाई ज़्यादा है तो हाउस होल्ड के पास पैसा ज़्यादा है, दे विल कंज्यूम मोर. टू गेट फुल मार्क्स यू विल हैव टू learn these links. Money supply is linked with your interest rate, which is linked with your exchange rate. So when you change your money supply, interest rate changes, that has effect on aggregate demand, and exchange rate changes, that also affects your aggregate demand. Now let me take you through these questions. With the help of diagrams, explain how both cost and demand pull inflation can be caused by a falling exchange rate that I just explained to you over here. Explain what is likely to happen to the price level if the quantity of money increases significantly. This is the answer that I just explained to you over here. And explain why an increase in the money supply and, this is again a typo, and rising world energy prices are categorized as different causes of inflation. इस क्वेश्चन को फिर से तुम इसी तरह स्ट्रक्चर करोगे. There is demand pull inflation, there is cost push inflation. Give the basic definition, theoretical definition through the graphs what these things are. और उसके बाद बता दो money supply, it can affect your household's consumption as well as investment, and therefore aggregate demand increases causing demand pull inflation, whereas rising world energy prices means cost of production will increase, aggregate supply will shift to right, and there will be cost push inflation. Now again, as I have been telling you, don't memorize these questions. It was my responsibility to highlight for you कि aggregate demand के shifts में money supply, interest rate, exchange rate, income tax and government spending को याद रखो, और aggregate supply की side पे cost of production and changes in the quantity quality of resources को याद रखो, and then just use your common sense. I mean, यहाँ पे मैंने तुम्हें एक चीज़ नहीं करवाई, but let me actually test you. If I ask you, tariffs बढ़ गए, tariffs are like taxes on imports, import की price बढ़ जाती है, will that create demand pull or cost push inflation? क्या होगा economy में if the amount of tariffs increase? Can anybody work that out? That is something that I have not explained to you, but use your sense. Tariffs बढ़ते हैं तो aggregate. Why?
सर बेसिकली हमारी इंपोर्ट की जो प्राइसेस हैं वो ज़्यादा हो रही हैं, यानी हम जैसे हमारी कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन फिर उससे ज़्यादा हो जाएगी.
ठीक है, the only link you have missed is कि if your country is importing raw materials, then yes, cost of production will increase, cost push inflation होगी. Very good. What about demand pull inflation? टैरिफ बढ़ने से demand pull inflation होगी?
सर हो भी सकती है, क्योंकि अब हम वो सारे प्रोडक्ट्स कंट्री के अंदर से डिमांड कर रहे हैं.
मुझे
एग्रीगेट डिमांड राइटवर्ड शिफ्ट करेगा.
क्यों, कौन सा कंपोनेंट चेंज होगा एग्रीगेट डिमांड का?
सर इंपोर्ट्स हमारी कम हो गई ना.
ओके,
तो नेट एक्सपोर्ट्स ओवरऑल
गुड
इंक्रीज हो
गुड गुड. तो ये तुमने बताना है, ये तुमने बताना है. मैं तुम्हें बार बार कह रहा हूँ, इन सारी चीज़ों में जब भी तुमने किसी चीज़ का भी इम्पैक्ट करना है मैक्रो इकोनॉमी में, डोंट से डायरेक्टली एग्रीगेट डिमांड इंक्रीज होगी. जो अभी तुमने बताया, यू शुड हैव टोल्ड दैट इनिशियली, एंड दैट इज़ व्हाट यू विल राइट इन योर क्वेश्चन कि टैरिफ बढ़ेगा, टैरिफ बढ़ने से इम्पोर्ट की प्राइस बढ़ेगी, एंड व्हेन इम्पोर्ट्स आर मोर एक्सपेंसिव तो इम्पोर्ट्स कम हो जाएंगी, which means this export minus import and next component, if imports are less, this whole thing will increase, so your aggregate demand will increase and you will also have demand pull inflation. So इसलिए मैं तुम्हें structure से मेरा मतलब रट्टा नहीं है, structure से मेरा मतलब यही है कि if I tell you X variable is changing, what will be the impact on economy? X variable is changing, what will be the impact on inflation? अगर तुम इसको aggregate demand का change दिखा रहे हो तो you have to tell me that look, when X changes, flana component of aggregate demand increases, give your reasoning for that and then move on. कि therefore aggregate demand will increase and demand pull inflation या cost push inflation होगी. So good, very good, you had the right answer, but थोड़ा सा उसको इस तरीके से explain करो. And don't hide what you know. Don't assume कि ये तो examiner को पता ही होगा. मैं तुम्हें बार बार कहता हूँ, for every single sentence that makes some sense तुम्हें एक नंबर मिलता है. So it's not a difficult paper, but never assume कि ये बात बताने की क्या ज़रूरत है, ये तो पता ही होगी. If it is, I always say, don't write irrelevant things, but जैसे अभी तुम ये सारा लॉजिक लिंक रीजनिंग एक्सप्लेन कर रहे थे कि why have you figured it out कि एग्रीगेट डिमांड इंक्रीज होगी, don't hide that chain of reasoning from the examiner, write that down. वो analysis काउंट होता है. ओके, इन क्वेश्चंस को मैं अभी छोड़ रहा हूँ. हु अमंग्स कंज्यूमर्स, प्रोड्यूसर्स और गवर्नमेंट इज मोर लाइकली टू कॉज इन्फ्लेशन? आई थिंक आई हैव सेड अ लॉट अबाउट दिस. वही स्ट्रक्चर है, देयर इज डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन, देयर इज कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन. डिमांड पुल में बता दो, इट कैन बी द गवर्नमेंट थ्रू मैक्रो मॉनेटरी फिस्कल पॉलिसी, इट कैन बी द एक्सटर्नल सेक्टर. दूसरे मुल्क में इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ हो रही है, वो तुम्हारी एक्सपोर्ट्स खरीदने लग गए हैं, दैट वुड बी डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन. इट कैन सिंपली बी हाउस होल्ड एंड फर्म्स कॉन्फिडेंस. सो ऑल ऑफ दीज थ्री, प्रोड्यूसर्स, कंज्यूमर्स एंड गवर्नमेंट, कैन बी अ सोर्स ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन. गवर्नमेंट का याद रखो, गवर्नमेंट कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन भी करवा सकती है, हमारी जैसी गवर्नमेंट पेट्रोल पे टैक्स लगा देती है विच इंक्रीजेज द कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन इन द एंटायर इकोनॉमी. सो यू कैन राइट यू हैव इनफ मोर देन इनफ एमिनेशन. वही स्ट्रक्चर रखो, उसी के बीच में से इसका आंसर तुम निकाल लोगे. Anybody wants me just have a quick look, इसमें से कोई क्वेश्चन अगर ऐसा लग रहा है, you want me to say a few words and fine, otherwise we'll move on. ये 20 ये वाले जो 3 हैं, November 2010 to June 2010, just have a quick look. If anybody wants me to explain तो मुझे बता दो, otherwise we'll move on. चलो, I will assume all of you are fine. अच्छा जी, उसके बाद हमारे पास causes ये complete हो गए. We have been doing a lot of questions, but as you can see, ultimately what you see over here in the red, this is basically the sort of base जिससे तुम सारे आंसर निकाल सकते हो. Okay, so take a screenshot if you want. If you have noted it down, fine. You should have noted it down anyway in the class. So that is the causes of inflation. Important, don't skip it. Make sure you can answer all of these questions.